This is a real mystery. Friends and family of this young woman, Laci Peterson, are gathering at the family home. You can see that they've been putting up flyers in the neighborhood here for the last day and a half. They've also been canvassing a park which is nearby this area where Laci was last seen on Christmas Eve about 9:30 in the morning. Her husband, Scott, had gone to the Bay Area to go fishing. When he returned, Laci was nowhere to be found.
Christmas Day, I get a call from Al Brocchini in the morning, right about 9 o'clock. And first thing he does, he asks me what I'm doing. I said, well, you probably remember what I'm doing. I'm taking my kids over to their mom's. And I'm thinking, well, this is a call for overtime. And I asked him what's going on. He said he had a missing, that he was working, and I asked him if he needed any help. And he said he did. Getting down to our detective office, I talked to Al, and he told me that he'd actually worked on this case from the prior evening on Christmas Eve. He had been called out to talk to Scott and interview him regarding Laci being missing. And in the process of doing this, he didn't find anything that was obvious that made him think that Scott had done anything wrong. But Scott's demeanor was a little bit too calm compared to the other family members. And he had documented a bunch of things that were essential later on in the investigation, like no forced entry into the house and Scott's demeanor and specific things that Scott did when he came back from fishing. But in addition to that, he said that we had to go back out there and talk to Scott a little bit more, which was fine with me because I hadn't met him yet. And so we went back over to the house after that. And we pulled up on Covina, facing south, pulled up next to the house on the curb there. And I saw Scott up to the left. He was walking from the southeast to the northwest. And we got out of the car. Al greeted him. You remembered Al from the prior evening. And Al introduced me to Scott. And first impression, like anybody's first impression of Scott, is pleasant, friendly, very controlled. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't frantic or anything like that. He did have a lot of questions for us, which seemed kind of strange for me, but I'd only been with him for a few moments at that time. So right after that, I went over to talk to the neighbor to the south, Karen Service, to get more details from her, specifically when she found the dog, how she found the dog, and the things that were taking place on Christmas Eve for her that day. Karen was like one of the neighbors that you would really want to have living next door to you. She was very friendly. She was very accurate about things that she remembered from the day prior, as far as finding the dog with the leash, putting the dog back in the Petersons' backyard. In addition to that, she had left to go shopping in downtown Modesto, and she had a receipt for a purchase that she made that helped us determine the time between when Scott left the house and when the dog was discovered. And that was very helpful to show that there wasn't a lot of time between when Scott pulled out of the driveway and the dog was found. So she gave us background information about Scott and Laci. She'd been to their house many times for barbecues and events and things like that. And just good neighbors, nothing bad to say about either one of them. Scott was very helpful to her at her house. Scott was handy, so he could fix things because she was living alone at that time. And again, just it started to become a common theme that we were finding that everybody pretty much loved Scott.
They were pretty friendly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, and this was common throughout all the contacts we had with Scott and people that knew Scott before Amber came forward, is everybody spoke very highly of him. And it was a shock to many people that Scott had another side of his life that people weren't aware of.
Would you be willing for me to take a gunshot residue off your hands?
Sure, no problem. Outboard exhaust show up as dead shot residue or something different?
What? Exhaust?
Yeah, from that outboard.
Well, you showered after you said, so I'm not thinking this is even a routine, but no, it wouldn't.
Well, it really wasn't an interrogation. Interrogations are done when you have evidence to confront somebody with. And so you have an interview when you're trying to gather facts and you're trying to keep an open, friendly dialogue with somebody. And even though interrogations can be pointed and they can become somewhat aggressive, to keep the communication going, it's unlike television dramas where they show the detective slamming down a phone book or ridiculous things like that. You do that, the first thing the guy's going to do is he's going to say something bad about your mother, and he's going to throw some profanity at you, and then he's going to ask for an attorney. So you have to have a certain amount of patience dealing with these people, because it's not that you're trying to throw them in jail. It's you're trying to find the truth more than anything else. And if you create an atmosphere where they don't want to cooperate with you, you're not going to get the truth. Now, they might lie to you, and that's common, and there's no big deal there, because you can usually disprove that lies or any of their lies through a variety of other sources. But as far as Al's original contact with Scott, strictly an interview, fact-finding, fact-gathering, friendly, leave the door open for further communication. When Al first started talking to Scott, he told Scott that Scott might not like him after a while, because Al was going to have to ask Scott a variety of questions that might seem uncomfortable. But he also told Al that his purpose was simply to find out what happened to Laci. And if Scott's goal was the same as Al's, he really shouldn't have any problem with that. Well, the big purpose for me going over there with Al is, number one, to meet Scott and kind of get a read on him and what his demeanor was, and do a comparison with that with other people that we were going to meet later that day and then the days to follow. And then, of course, I was there to talk to Karen Service and get her statement locked down, because Al was still dealing with certain details with Scott. One of the things that came up when I first met Scott, and this existed throughout all of our contacts, which were pretty much always pleasant. Scott was pretty easy to deal with. His cooperation was guarded, and it was limited. If we got into areas that he didn't want to go into, he would mention his attorney and that he'd have to run that information by his attorney. Pretty unusual for us in a situation like this. Usually people don't do that. They have the right to do it, but generally they don't. They don't put limits on their cooperation. But comparing Scott from the day I met him all the way until the last time I saw him, he never showed any frantic desire to figure out what happened to Laci compared to her mom Sharon, her sister Amy, her brother Brent. Everybody that was from Laci's circle, whether it was Stacy or Lori or Renee or Kim or Ron Gransky, Dennis Rocha, Laci's father, everybody was frantic about where she was, what happened to her, when she was coming back, with the exception of Scott. Now, this could mean that he just had an enormous amount of self-control, which I believe he does, but it also, I've seen it before in other cases where I had guys like this that didn't show that. So it was something I'd seen before. It didn't mean that he had killed her, but because of his demeanor and because of his limited cooperation, it just meant that we had to keep digging until we could find out that he either didn't have anything to do with Laci's disappearance, or enough evidence came up to show us that he did. Well, I'd worked with Al for a while, and I liked working with him. He didn't have a lazy bone in his body. He was always willing to do 100%. One of the first things that I wanted to do with Scott is I wanted to get him on a polygraph. And although polygraph results are not admissible in court unless the prosecution and defense both agree to it, the polygraph is a really useful tool for detectives because it gauges cooperation level when you ask somebody if they're willing to take the poly. But in addition to that, the polygraph, if it's run by somebody who knows what they're doing, will give you some clues as to whether or not there's some anxiety present with this person and whether it looks like they might have had something to do with it. Do they tell truthful answers? Do they show deception in the questions? And in Scott's case, Al had asked him the night before if he'd be willing to take a poly. He said he was. And so one of the first things I did is I called the lead polygraph operator, Doug Mansfield from California Department of Justice, who actually was my neighbor. And he gets a lot of calls from me, or at least he did back then, about things like this. I told him what we were working. Of course, bear in mind, this was Christmas Day, and he had no hesitation whatsoever. He said, yeah, I'll come right down. And he did. And we'd worked with Doug on many, many other murder cases in the past. He was a very gifted interviewer, and he knew how to run the polygraph very well. But when he came down and we started getting information together as far as what kind of questions he was going to ask. By that time, Scott decided, apparently through input from his father, that he wasn't going to take the polygraph. In and around this same time, because we saw where this was probably going, at least my early feelings were because of Laci's past and the kind of life she led, I was pessimistic. I thought she was never coming home. I figured she was already dead. So the next guy up for rotation to catch the next homicide was Craig Grogan. And I had just had a double murder 10 days earlier, so I came off the rotation. We called Craig after talking to the supervisor, Al Carter, and Craig came down to start taking over the case officer details. Craig was going to be the lead in the case. Al and I were going to be working with him and doing the things that he wouldn't have time for.
You mentioned Laci's past. What do you mean?
Well, we see victims, and they come in all shapes and sizes and experience levels. And some victims, they risk their life by doing foolish things with drugs and alcohol and getting involved in violence and foolishness. And Laci, she's 8 months pregnant. She's really looking forward to having this child. It's kind of every girl's dream. She's got the nursery going. It looks like it was designed out of a magazine. She's got the perfect husband. He's attentive and he's pleasant. Everybody seems to like him. You throw on top of that, they've got this nice little gingerbread-like house. And going inside the house, it was impeccable, the way it was taken care of and the way they created this little atmosphere. So I didn't see Laci as somebody who would take unnecessary risks. She wasn't using narcotics. She wasn't out partying with a bunch of, people that are of a bad influence. She's just looking forward to having this baby. So because of these things, comparing her with other victims that I'd seen in the past, she didn't lead an at-risk lifestyle, and that's what made me believe pretty much from the start that she wasn't coming home. Of course, you can't tell that to the family. You don't really know it for sure, but we'd also been doing this for a while, and we'd seen this happen in the past.
Hey, beautiful. I just left a message at home. 2:15. I live in Berkeley. I won't be able to get to Villa Farms to get that basket for Papa. I was hoping you would get this message and go on out there. I'll see you in a bit, sweetie. Love you. Bye.
End of message.
I mean, I don't know too many guys that have been married for 5 years that are talking like that to their wife. That's kind of out there. But Scott was very cooperative when it came to giving a timeline on what he was doing when he was talking to Al Brocchini. So he explained that he had loaded some patio umbrellas into the back of his pickup truck. And he had these in the backyard, and he was moving those over to his warehouse so they wouldn't be around, apparently, during the holiday season. And as he did that, he had the truck backed in the driveway. And a couple of the neighbors had mentioned they had never, ever seen him back the truck in the driveway. So when he backed it in, it was real handy. The back of the truck was right by the door that goes out from the, it's kind of like a TV room that they had in the front of the house. It was a converted garage, and there was a side door on the north side that went out to the truck. And he loaded the patio umbrellas into the truck. My belief is he loaded those on top of Laci as a way to disguise her so that if anybody looked in the bed of the truck, they wouldn't see her. She was probably wrapped up in something. I don't know what it was. There was all sorts of different theories on whether it was a blue tarp or whether it was a blanket or anything like that. But it fits with some little minor evidence things that were noticed early on. There was a throw rug that was by this door that goes out to the north side of the house by the carport. And that throw rug was bunched up by the door. Now, Scott gave the explanation to that the cat or the dog had done that. And maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But it wouldn't be inconsistent with dragging a dead body from the bedroom across the floor through that TV room out to the truck and bunching up the rug in the process. So the thing about the patio umbrellas that was kind of interesting was he didn't leave them at the warehouse. He did bring them back to the house after he returned from the fishing trip. And so that's it. By itself, it really means nothing. But when you start categories of evidence and you start putting these things together and adding them up, you start making a list of circumstantial evidence that doesn't make sense. And the umbrellas being returned were part of that. So when Scott left the house, we were able to determine through cell phone records and where his cell phone was pinging on the antennas that he drove to his warehouse over in West Modesto near the freeway, and he stayed there for a certain period of time. His explanation while he was there is he checked his email. He had a mortising tool that he had been delivered for woodworking and that he partially assembled while he was there. And then he backed the truck in and hooked up the boat trailer to the truck. And then he drove up to Berkeley Marina, launched the boat, piloted the boat north through the bay towards Brooks Island. He had specific details about the sign that was on Brooks Island as far as you can't land here, you can't get on the island, there's no trespassing there. And then he came back. He had a timed stamped parking permit that he'd gotten when he pulled into the parking lot there at Berkeley Marina. Apparently some guys saw him either launching his boat or recovering his boat with the trailer, trying to load it, and I guess he backed a trailer about the way I would, not very skilled, and they made some remarks on it, and he was noticed. And I'm not sure if that was the reason that he finally changed his alibi that originally he had told earlier was going to be for golfing. The day before, when he had gotten his hair cut by Laci's sister, Amy, he had mentioned to her that on Christmas Eve, he was going to go golfing at Del Rio Country Club. He'd also told this to Ron Gransky, who was Laci's stepdad, Sharon's longtime companion. And later on, he changed that alibi. He said it was too cold to go golfing, so he decided to go fishing. Well, that doesn't make much sense to me. You go out on the water, it's going to be colder on the water than it is going to be on the golf course. And then, of course, you're driving 80 miles to go up to Berkeley to launch your boat. It didn't seem to make too much sense when he could just go up to the Sierras, up to Woodward Reservoir, maybe 30 miles away, and launch his boat up there. But regardless, this is one of the things that he did when he went there. Now, there's been people in the past that have made remarks about Laci being in the bed of the truck and that she could have been spotted. Well, maybe she could have been if she wasn't wrapped up, if she wasn't disguised, if she wasn't under the patio umbrellas. But also, this is on Christmas Eve, and there wasn't a lot of activity at this warehouse. It was kind of like a strip mall warehouse, overhead doors, things like that. But there was no flurry of activity before the holidays because it wasn't a retail kind of situation where people are shopping. So it would have been real easy for him to back the truck partially into the warehouse itself and transfer Laci's wrapped up body into the boat, cover the boat with the boat cover, and then hook the trailer up to the truck and drive up to Berkeley. And once he got up there, he said he took the boat out for a while. He said he did some fishing, but he was never specific with any of the officers or even with Brocchini as far as what he was fishing for. He had a 2-day fishing license that he had purchased on December 20th, but he had not filled in the date as far as when he was going to be fishing when he purchased the license. So that, to me, also goes along with some premeditation because it was open-ended as far as if or when he was going to kill Laci. But in addition to that, his packages of lures, which were for freshwater fishing, substantially different from saltwater fishing, had not even been opened. So the boat did test positive for having salt water in the motor and in the bottom of the boat, but there was no evidence that he was doing any fishing, and he couldn't speak specifically about fishing. Whereas if you go across the street here to my neighbor's house and you mention fishing for him, to him, he'll talk to you for 3 hours about it, and he knows exactly what he's looking for. So open things like this that don't really make sense make detectives suspicious. And we look for answers on things like that, and that's what we were doing with Scott. Later on in the investigation, when they processed the warehouse and the boat specifically, one of the things that they discovered, besides salt water in the boat and salt water in the motor, is they discovered that there was a hair that was wrapped up in a pair of needle-nose pliers that were in the bottom of the boat, partially underneath one of the seats that goes across the boat. And when the pliers was opened, it separated this hair. So it took one hair and it turned it into 2 hairs. They did analysis on this hair, and it wasn't absolutely conclusive because they didn't have the root, and the only way that you can match DNA on a hair is through the root to the victim. But in this case, they were able to get a presumptive match on the hair to the same kind of hair that was on Laci's head. To me, it kind of cuts both ways. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that she was in the boat before that, but it doesn't mean that she wasn't in the boat on that day. My belief is, and the circumstantial evidence seems to support that, the jury's verdict certainly did, is that pliers quite probably was used to help tie the weights to her limbs and used to sink her out in San Francisco Bay, and that would explain why that hair is in there. Now, is it possible that Laci could have been to the warehouse before that and discovered the boat, and maybe her hair was left behind and got wrapped up in the pliers? I know there's a lot of people that want to believe that. However, that kind of flies in the face of statements that we received from Laci's family and friends. Sharon Rocha in particular knew nothing about this boat. And when she first heard about it, she was astounded by it. Laci's friends, Stacy, Renee, Kim, Lori, they all said that Laci knew nothing about the boat. Because if she had, Laci would have told her friends that Scott bought a boat. And I know guys with boats down here where I live, and whenever they're getting a boat, that's pretty much the excitement of the neighborhood. Everybody knows so-and-so is getting a boat because you can't not talk about it to your buddies. And so for Scott to keep the boat quiet, for Scott to have the boat from December 9th all the way up to the 24th when he first put it in the water and not trying it before that, suggests to me that he was keeping that secret, not letting people know about it because he had premeditated plans to kill his wife. When Al Brocchini first looked in the warehouse on Christmas Eve, he went there with Scott. And Scott told Al that there was no power in the warehouse, so they couldn't turn on the lights inside the warehouse. Al chalked that up to that there was no power in the warehouse section, but not necessarily the office, which would have allowed Scott to use his computer and things like that. So Al turned his headlights into the warehouse, and there was the aluminum boat that was on the trailer, but in addition to that aluminum boat, there was a flatbed trailer that was rectangular, had the wheels, and it had wood on the floor of it. This was used for hauling fertilizer because Scott sold fertilizer. On this flatbed trailer, Al looked and he saw what he believed to be 4 to 5 crescent-shaped rings that were about the size of like a coffee can or a bucket that one would use if they mixed up ready-mix cement and poured it into the bucket to harden it to make homemade anchors that people often use on boats when they're fishing in fresh water. As the cement is curing into concrete, they take a U-shaped bend of reinforcing bar, they call it rebar, and they stick it down into the cement itself so you have a loop which is going to be locked into the concrete once it hardens. And of course, you can tie a rope to that, throw it over the side of the boat, there's your anchor. And there was one anchor that was found in the boat, found in the front of the boat. Bucket wasn't on it. We never did recover the bucket. Don't know where that is. Suspect it's probably on the bottom of San Francisco Bay. But the funny thing about the anchor that was in the front of Scott's boat is there was no anchor rope for it. And an anchor really isn't going to do you a lot of good if you're anchoring your boat if you don't have a rope to attach it to. So just little things like this make detectives suspicious, and it puts us in a position where we need to look at these things a little bit further. But as they start to mount up, they start to be more than just interesting. They start to become kind of compelling. And as we're looking at Scott, people have oftentimes will say, well, you didn't look at anybody else. Well, yeah, you can say that, but we did. And here's a reason to know that we did look at other people, because if we hadn't, if there'd been no documentation in our reports and in our investigation when we went to trial, Mark Garagos and his team of skilled lawyers would have trumpeted that in front of the jury like a 4th of July parade. They would have made the biggest deal about that we didn't look at anybody else. We weren't the only detectives working on this case. There were many others working on it, whether it was detectives and officers that were checking with parolees that had commitment offenses for violent crimes, that did crimes against women, rapists, people like that, sexual assault criminals, anybody like that was in our database that we could check on that was in the area, they were all contacted. Their alibis were written down. Their alibis were confirmed. And this is one of the reasons that they didn't bring that up during the trial, is because not only was Scott thoroughly investigated, but other people were that could have done this. And so when it comes to the anchors itself, not only was that anchor found in the front of the boat, not only were those crescent-shaped patterns found on the flatbed trailer, but there was concrete residue that was on the inside of the boat where it would have been left if somebody was rolling a weighted body out of the boat. There was concrete residue that was located in the boat cover itself. In addition to that, when Laci's remains were found, she was missing her limbs, which were determined by the forensic pathologists that they were separated from decomposition, or it could have been through surgical precision. And without any doctors being involved in this murder, it seems more likely that she was weighted, she was put in the bottom of San Francisco Bay, and as time went by, it separated her limbs from her body, and that's why her body washed ashore.
Your first encounter with Sharon Rocha, and how was that?
You try to make this not come off bad. There's few things that are more interesting than working murder investigations. But there is a very bad part about working murder investigations, is having to see the family suffer. And I can't remember specifically the first time that I met with Sharon. Al Brocchini, of course, met with her before I did. And then, of course, with Craig Grogan being the lead on the case, he spent more time with her than I did. But the times that I did spend with her and any of the family members were terrible times, because you see people that they're not stupid, and I think they realize their loved one isn't coming home, but they don't want to admit it to themselves internally, whereas we pretty much figured that from the start. And the English language doesn't contain the proper words that will help people get through this. So you tell them we're doing everything we can. You work the case as best you can. You work it from the aspect of how is the defense going to attack your investigation if you find the guy that did it and you go to trial, and you rely on your experience to put it together that day. You just try to be an ear for these family members and give them as much compassion as possible. But internally you feel kind of guilty suggesting hope when in your mind you pretty much figure there ain't any.
Okay. Did you need a break or anything? Or?
No, I'm good.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah, the family members. That conjures up some bad stuff. You think about that stuff. It's interesting. I've been asked the question of why the Peterson case has become so big, and for us working murders, 140 of them, I think, is a little more than 140 when I retired. We had a lot of interesting cases, a lot of intriguing cases, and this wasn't really necessarily in the top 10 of really intriguing cases. It was the media interest in it made it kind of what it was. Slow news cycle. I don't know, maybe there wasn't much going on that the news people could grab onto, but you throw on top of it, it's the holiday season. You've got a girl who's pregnant, and of course there's an enormous amount of people that are watching the news that can identify with that, put themselves in that position. You've got an attractive victim. You've got an attractive husband. You've got a mystery. And as the local news grabbed onto it, I had heard in the past that there were family members that had notified the major network, or at least one of the major networks, and mentioned this case because they had a contact there in New York or someplace back east, and that might have kickstarted the national interest in the case. But with that, of course, the way the media works is they don't want to be the ones left out of a big story, so they all pile on top of it and grab for every bite they can get. It made our job a little bit more difficult because there was a lot of things that we wouldn't have had to do if the media hadn't been so attracted to this case. It created a lot of wild goose chases that we had to go down that we knew were probably ridiculous from the start. We had a lot of people that wanted to get involved in this case that had nothing to do with it. I remember there was one person that claimed they'd seen Laci in a grocery store up in Washington, and the local authorities up there spent an enormous amount of time reviewing videotape and things like that, and they finally determined that this person was making it up. And you get a lot of people that come forward. I remember all the psychics that would call, and it would be interesting. They'd call and they'd want to, well, who am I talking to? And I'm thinking to myself, well, you're the psychic. You ought to know who you're talking to. And they'd always say things like, well, we believe her remains are in salt water or something like that. And it's like, well, that's helpful. 3/4 of the surface of the earth is covered in salt water, so that doesn't narrow it down much. But we had to spend time with all those people, and it took up a lot of investigative time to put those things together. You can't leave them. You can't leave those things hanging because the defense is pretty sharp most of the time. And if they see that you didn't do something that you should have done, and it looks one-sided that you're only going after Scott, then they're going to attack you viciously in court. And the funny thing about Scott is, for the first several days, like first week or so, we couldn't find anything wrong with this guy. I mean, he was just the all-American boy, college student. He's got the baby on the way. He's got the pretty wife. He's belongs to the country club. He's got all these things going. He's got this circle of friends, and just nobody had a bad word to say about him until Amber came forward. Well, on or about December 30th, Al Brocchini was walking through our office, and our office was fairly big. There was like 34 detectives in there, and there was several clerks and a row of offices with the sergeants and the captain and the lieutenant and community service officers. And so it was a lot of people in that office. And Al is walking by Beverly's desk, and Beverly's desk was next to mine, but there was a pass-through between us. And she was on the headphones on the phone, and she was typing into her computer, so what she was typing was showing up on our monitor. And Al walks by, and he's watching these words come up, and he asks Beverly, are you talking to this person? And she said, well, yeah. And so Al grabs the phone, and he gets on the phone with Amber. And long story short, Amber pretty much said, I'm dating a guy named Scott Peterson. I think he might be related to your investigation. He lives in Sacramento, but I'm calling you because I've got information for you. And Al got a couple more tidbits from her and said, we're on our way. Don't go anywhere. And she said, yeah, I'll wait for you guys. So he grabs me. We go into the sergeant's office, and we tell Al Carter, we've got this lead down in Fresno. And Al said, go. Just don't tell anybody about it. Because we're trying to keep kind of a clamp on details like this because we don't want it getting out. So we drive down to Fresno. We get to Amber's place, and she's got her friend Sean Sibley there with her. And Sean is Amber's friend who had introduced Scott to Amber. Sean had been at a pest convention, for agricultural pest convention down in Anaheim, I think in like November or something like that, or October. And she had met Scott down there along with other people that were involved in fertilizer and pest things for agriculture. And Scott had projected himself at this convention that he was single and he was looking for a girlfriend and things like that. And Sean started talking to him. She was engaged, so she wasn't interested in him. And she said, she thought of Amber, and she, I got this friend. She's really nice, but, don't break her heart. Don't treat her like garbage. And Scott has he's very engaging. He's charming and things like that. And so he ends up contacting Amber. They start dating. And when we get down to Amber's place, she starts telling us about how he started romancing her from the start by bringing her roses. And he had strawberries and champagne in his room at the Sheraton or the Radisson, whatever he was staying at. And they went to dinner to this nice restaurant. He dressed really good. And it just kind of took off from there. He told her that he lived in Sacramento, but his office was in Modesto, and he traveled a lot. And fed her these stories about overseas travel, and part of it was probably true, but not all of it. And he mentioned to her that he was going to be having a lot of travel during the holidays and through January, but he was going to be available for a lot more time together after the end of January. And she is just digging all this because she's looking for a good guy. She's a single mother. I think her daughter was about 2 years old at the time. And Scott was very attentive with her daughter and all that. And Amber was interesting to talk to because I got the impression she didn't think that we would believe her on this. And so she had wine corks they'd had bottles of wine at dinner, and she had programs from events they had gone to and things like this. And so she's showing us all these items that confirm that they had been going to dinner and doing all these different things. And we really had no reason to disbelieve her at this point. Sean Sibley, we interviewed them separately, recorded, of course, and she provided the same information, but not with as much detail as Amber did. And then what we found out throughout all this is Amber didn't watch television. And Fresno was not in the Sacramento market for media coverage. So at the beginning, before the news coverage got giant, she wouldn't have caught it anyway because she wasn't watching TV. But a friend of hers who was a Fresno cop, he'd caught the coverage, and he had remembered that she was dating a guy named Scott Peterson. And so he had told her that you probably ought to get a hold of these Modesto cops. The guy you're dating could be the same guy that's involved in this missing thing. And so that's why she finally called us. And when we finished up with the interview, we had pretty much all the information we need. At that time, we were going to go eat lunch, so we asked them if Sean and Amber wanted to go with us. We figured, well, if we're eating and they're eating with us, they might come up with some other things that we remember, and we can jot those down too. And in the meantime, we drove over to this strip mall, and there was a Radio Shack there. At the time, it was a retail place where they sold electronics. And so we asked Amber if she would have a problem recording phone calls with Scott. And we didn't really know what her alliance was at that time, but she called us, so we thought it's probably worth a gamble. And she said, yeah, she'd cooperate with that. So Al bought a device to attach to her cell phone. I had an extra recorder in the trunk of the car with a bunch of tapes and some batteries, and we showed her how to work the thing. And Scott calls, right as we're showing her this. And so the number shows up on her screen. Al recognizes the number. I didn't. And so Al told her, we'll take that call. And so she did. So she started talking to him. Well, she didn't know it at that time, but we already had a court-ordered wire intercept going on Scott's phone. So that call was going to be picked up anyway. But before we went to the restaurant, Amber comes out with this little jewel out of left field, totally unexpected. And she goes, would you be interested in some pictures? And I'm thinking, well, what? And she said, well, of Scott and I. It's like, yeah, we'd probably be interested in those. And so we go to Rite Aid or CVS, Walgreens, I don't remember which it was. And she gives a claim ticket to the gal behind the counter, and she comes out with this envelope that's got the double pictures. So it's got photo prints, but doubles. And, this is kind of before cell phone camera stuff was out there. And we open these things up, and here they are. Scott in the tuxedo, Amber in the red dress. Just a whole slew of these pictures. Them sitting on the couch. He's whispering in her ear, all this ridiculousness. And these are just epic. Anybody who's probably watching this probably saw those pictures. And it's kind of locked in at that time that she wasn't full of, baloney. She was telling the truth. And we said, yeah, we'll take these pictures. That'll be good. And that's kind of how that all started out.
Now, her performance on the phone calls, was that coached to her? Or did you guys just say, hey, just when he calls you, do your thing?
Gosh, another great question, yeah. Amber was interesting because she was very fragile, and I was the only single guy in the unit. All the other guys I worked with were married, and so Al Carter assigned her to me to kind of be her handler because we knew that she was going to be calling at all hours, because every time she got off the phone from a call with Scott, she was kind of a wreck for a while. So she'd call me, and then I'd kind of have to talk to her about what's going on and everything and calm her down. I don't remember ever dealing with, well, I had one other, but there were two gals that I remember from another murder case and then the Peterson case that were the most magnificent, unscripted, uncoached actresses that you could imagine. And these gals were so good. This one gal that helped us on a drive-by shooting, and then, of course, Amber on Peterson. I didn't tell her what to say. We didn't have to, because she no training whatsoever. We're not getting paid or anything like that. But she was able to weave these conversations into bringing out details from the past that she had told us about, but we had no documentation on.
You deserve so much better. There's no question you deserve so much better.
Yeah, and I deserve to understand an explanation of why you told me you'd lost your wife and this was the first holidays you'd spend without her. That was December 9th. You told me this, and now all of a sudden your wife's missing? Are you kidding me? Did you hear me?
I did. I don't know what to say.
I think an explanation would be a start.
I know you absolutely deserve an explanation.
Yes, I do. I do. And you want to protect me from the media? Why did you involve me in this? And how long were you looking for me, Scott?
I'm sorry?
How long were you looking for me?
Looking for you.
Isn't that what you told Sean? You were looking for me or someone like me?
And Scott apparently had no idea that this was going on. Well, we also had Amber's call on a wire intercept to make sure that we could monitor her calls if she wasn't recording them, so that we would know that she wasn't filling Scott with information of what was going on. But she had over 29 hours of recorded phone conversation during the time that we had her up on the wire. And in that amount of time, I think she missed 8 minutes of conversation, probably when she was hooking the device up, her daughter's in the backseat of the car, things like that. But her ability to keep things calm and not tip her hand that she'd already talked to us was remarkable. I thought she did a fantastic job, and apparently the jury did too, because they enjoyed that or found it very useful in the trial. As time went by, of course, a lot of people are trying to find reasonable doubt in Scott's guilt by claiming that, well, there was that burglary across the street, and we have that saying that there's no coincidences in homicide investigations, and that's generally true. And then people say, well, that's a coincidence, Jon. Well, it is, but when you take that by itself and then you compare it with all the other coincidences of the stack of circumstantial evidence against Scott, the Medina burglary is pretty minor in comparison. But in a nutshell, there was, I believe it was about a 20-minute time window between when Scott left and when Karen Service put the dog in the backyard. And so the skeptics want the reasonable doubt to reflect that during that period of time, Laci had come back from the walk, had seen the burglary taking place across the street, confronted the burglars in the van. She'd been abducted in the van, tossed in there, and taken away. Well, it's interesting. You've got all these different people that come forward and claim they saw Laci walking that day and in a variety of different locations, all these different sightings. But when you scrutinize it a little bit more, none of the people that claimed they saw Laci that day knew her before that day. So they couldn't make a match on familiar facial recognition the way you could if you see your neighbor day in and day out. But in addition to that, there were 3 other gals attractive that walked the neighborhood, 2 of which were pregnant. One had a chocolate lab, one had a golden retriever. Easily could have been mistaken as Laci by somebody who's not specifically familiar with any of those gals. And so when it comes to that, intentions oftentimes are good, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes people just want to get involved in the big thing that's going on, and there might be some of that going on here. But with the burglary taking place, if you run it out to a logical conclusion, if the burglars abducted Laci, first off, if they're going to try and frame Scott, they're not going to hide the body on the bottom of San Francisco Bay. Are they going to take the risk to transport the body when everybody's looking for Laci from Modesto to San Francisco Bay. Much different than when Scott was going up there when nobody was looking for Laci. In addition to that, I see a lot of boaters down here, and most of them are not burglars. So to think that there's burglars that are out boating and things like that seems kind of suspicious to me, that people would actually believe that. There was a $500,000 reward that was leading for the return of Laci, her uninjured recovery. And there was a $50,000 reward leading to the recovery of her remains if she was murdered or had met death some way. And nobody came forward to collect those rewards. Now, if you're doing property crime and you're stealing things from people's homes to support a drug habit or whatever you're using it for, to think that if more than one person knew about Laci being abducted, to think that their loyalty would trump a $500,000, well, you're looking at things differently than I do. I just don't see it happening that way, especially when rewards come out and people come forward for $50. But to think that they're going to keep this stuff quiet. In addition to that, that burglary was thoroughly investigated. The two guys that were involved in it over a period of 2 days immediately copped out to it. They immediately admitted their involvement in it for the specific reason that they didn't want to be linked to Laci's disappearance because of that unwritten code in a custodial facility, whether it's a local jail or state prison. There's certain crimes that people that get incarcerated don't care about, but there is a classification of crimes where if you abduct and kill a mother, a pregnant mother, you're not going to be looked upon too favorably by the other people that are locked up with you. And to think that these guys are going to jail, one of them had a warrant, of course they're both arrested for the burglary, and they know they're going to get locked up. They were almost begging to get polygraphs so that they could show the other inmates that they had nothing to do with this. All the property that was taken from the Medina burglary was recovered, and other property that wasn't even associated with that burglary was recovered because people that these burglars had sold that property to or given it to, they wanted away from that. And so other property that wasn't even associated with Medina's burglary was recovered. We even had a guy that came in the lobby of the police department with a bag full of stolen property, dumped it, masked up, ran out. They couldn't catch him because he went down the street. And this is the way people felt about this case. They didn't want to be anywhere near it to be dragged into it. Back around mid-January or so, we got information that the National Enquirer was going to run a story with a picture of Scott and Amber together. And although Al Brocchini and I had taken the photo prints from Amber when we'd gotten those at the photo counter, I had left the negatives to those photos with Amber so that she would know that we trusted her. And there were other photos on there that had nothing to do with the Peterson case. I didn't think we could really take those. She said that she was going to make sure they were protected. I can speculate on that, but that's not necessary. Anyway, somehow those photos either got out or they were photos taken by somebody who was there and they got released. And the next thing you know, the National Enquirer's got one of the photos with Amber in the red dress and Scott in the tux, and they're going to run it in that week's edition of the National Enquirer. Well, we have never dealt with that before on a case. We've dealt with a lot of things in homicide before, so we roundtabled that. What do we do on that? Well, you can't ignore it, and at the same time, we don't have the authority to tell the Enquirer don't run it. Their First Amendment rights trump what we want done on the case, and so we knew that they were going to publish it. But we also don't want the family members, especially the Roaches. You can imagine Sharon going to the grocery store and she's at the check stand and here's a picture of Scott and Amber, who she'd never met, there at the check stand. We can't do that to the family. So we called Sharon and Ron Gransky and asked them if they would come down to our office so that we could talk to them. And this wasn't something that we did very often. So Brocchini and I were going to speak with them. Craig Grogan, along with another Modesto officer who had a pilot's license, and Phil Owen, another Modesto detective, took a plane and they flew down to San Diego to meet with Scott's parents. And the plan was that both sets of family members were going to be shown this photo. And I wasn't in the San Diego part of the trip, so I'm not going to comment too much on that. But we brought Sharon in and Ron, and they were apprehensive because we didn't call them to come and meet with us very often, and made a little bit of small talk and everything. And they were scheduled to do an interview that night with Greta Van Susteren. So this was before they were going to do the interview. So we had the photo, and I had it in a folder, and Sharon was sitting across from me, and I said, well, there's some things that have developed on this case, and we want to make you aware of them before you get surprised and ambushed by them. And so I opened up the folder and I slid it across the table, and Sharon Rocha looked at it, and I just remember her words. She just said, why did he have to kill her? And then she buried her head in her hands and started weeping. And Gransky pretty much in the same condition. And I think this is probably the first time that she had concrete proof that probably substantiated the fears that she had all along that Laci wasn't coming home. And we gave them a little bit quick briefing on what took place on this. And we said, don't draw any necessarily conclusions for this, keep an open mind. And then they canceled their interview with Greta, and then they left the office. So that was pretty much it on that. It was, that's heartbreaking for when you see that, even though you're not related to these people, you can try to understand what their pain is like, but pretty difficult if you're not in that boat.
Was there a point where you thought, yeah, this is our guy? Was there one point, or did it collectively kind of happen?
Over the period of time that we worked, Scott, I'm always suspicious of the person closest to the victim, and that's how you start a murder investigation, is you always look at the person closest, because you have to work outwards from there. And you're going to be attacked in court if you don't clear people that are close to the victim. So this is the reason that detectives have to have, the obnoxious task of asking close family members things that are uncomfortable. Like, do you have anybody else on the side? Do you have a drug habit? Do you have a gambling habit? Anything like this that could come up that would, give a motive or something like that. So with Scott, as time went by, that first week, it was really tough to find anything wrong with him. And so I wasn't convinced that he had anything to do with it. I just was pretty much convinced that Laci wasn't coming home. But once Amber came forward, and then we saw there was this other side of the guy, then as we start adding up all the circumstantial evidence, it starts becoming much more interesting, much more compelling, at the same time that we're clearing out anybody else that could have anything to do with this. So whether it was some other violent offender that was on parole in the community, and as those guys are getting cleared from involvement by verifying their alibis, and more questions are coming up from Scott. His condition, or his cooperation, becomes more conditional. As that goes on, it gets to the point where it's starting to become pretty obvious that he had something to do with this. Little things that came up during this time period. Before Amber came forward, nobody had anything bad to say about Scott. And that's partially because people are smart. They don't want to create an atmosphere where if he didn't have anything to do with it, those words are going to haunt them in the relationship in the future. But over and above that, when Amber came forward, now it kind of peeled back layers of this onion, and people would start telling us information, whether it was Laci's friends, family members, things like that. Little tidbits about they were at a barbecue the summer before Laci became pregnant, and there was a new baby there, and everybody was holding the baby. And when they were trying to get Scott to hold the baby, he recoiled from it like it was a rattlesnake. He didn't want to be involved in that. I remember there was a quote that somebody had attributed to him that when Laci became pregnant and they were at a barbecue and they said something to him about, well, you're probably pretty excited about the baby coming along. And he made this offhand, kind of humorous comment, well, I was kind of hoping for infertility. Well, by themselves, they really mean nothing. But they also start to paint a picture of a reluctant father, somebody who really isn't too excited about all this. There were things that during the time that Laci was pregnant, Scott really didn't have much to do with touching Laci's stomach and feeling the baby or anything like that. And Sharon mentioned things like that. Little things that don't really mean anything early on, that they didn't want to say anything about, but when they start coming forward, then they start adding up, and we just keep gathering and taking these facts where they go. Well, again, Scott is a very, very charming, very convincing person. And, we saw this throughout his phone calls, whether he was talking to his dad and his brother, things like that. He could transition from weeping with Amber on the phone over something, and then the next moment he's on a phone call talking to his dad about going to have cocktails in Del Mar or something like that. His chameleon-like ability to transition from one role to another was very interesting. Great actor. But his phone conversations, they kind of showed a side of him also, and they can be interpreted a couple of different ways depending on how you want to look at it. There was one call in particular. Media frenzy was taking place when the Bay search was locating something that was on the bottom of San Francisco Bay that could have been a body. And there was a big media blitz about that. Well, they determined that this was a boat anchor, and not a little anchor. I mean, a big anchor, it'd be about the size of a human body. And so this information was given to Sharon Rocha. So she called Scott on his cell, and Scott had a habit of very seldom picking up the phone. He would screen his calls, listen to the voicemails, and then decide what to do with the calls. Well, the call from Sharon said that it was a boat anchor, nothing to worry about there. Of course, we knew that. And as she's saying this on the recording, of course, Scott's up on the wire, you can hear him in kind of a subdued whistle. He goes, kind of like, I dodged a bullet on that. They didn't find her. Now, other people could say, and I can see it both ways, they can say, well, he made that whistle because he was relieved that Laci could still be out there. Well, it just depends on which way you look at it and which way it goes. And that's what the jury is for, is to make those determinations.
You have one unheard message. First message. Hi, Scott. This is Mom. It's about 1:45. Just wanted to know, I just got a call from Ron Cloward. He's at the marina, and it was a boat anchor. Of course, we knew it wasn't Laci, but I just wanted you to know. I'm going to call your house in case you don't get this message first. Bye. Message erased.
But Scott, he was talking to Amber when he was at the vigil on New Year's Eve. And there's a photo that was taken of Scott. He's all smiles. Everybody else is a wreck. And he's on the phone talking to Amber. She's down in Fresno. He's in Modesto. He's talking about how he's over in Paris, walking on the dew-colored or covered cobblestones during the fireworks by the Eiffel Tower, and that there's American pop songs being played in the background, painting a vivid, incredible picture of what he's doing over there with the correct time frame too. He's got it right at New Year's celebration, which is the time frame between Modesto and Paris. The guy, he really was gifted in putting these things together. Great actor.
Happy New Year's.
Happy New Year.
I wanted to call you.
Thank you.
Amber, you there?
I'm here.
Amber,
I wish you could hear me.
I'm on the, I think that you're there. I'm near the Eiffel Tower. New Year's celebration is unreal. The crowd is huge.
The crowd's huge?
Amber,
Yes, I'm here.
Amber, you're there. I can't hear you right now, but I'll call you on your New Year's.
But he's at his wife's vigil on this. And to me, this is a pretty strong indicator that he just didn't give a crap about Laci. He was tired of all this hoopla. He just wanted it to be over. And it harkens back to that one thing that he told Amber early on, that after January, he would have a lot more time to devote to their relationship. And my suspicions is he compared the media length and coverage on Kristen Smart, the missing girl from down there in San Luis Obispo, to this thing, and probably thought it was going to be over within a month, not having any idea that the media was going to grab onto this like a pit bull and not let go. And so when it came to his conversations, I remember the one that was suspicious to me from the start. Brocchini played it for me on that first day, on Christmas Day, when Scott was coming back from Berkeley Marina. He'd made a call to Laci. Her cell phone battery was dead. People had known that, but he left a message. And it was words to the effect of, "Hey, beautiful, I'm coming back from fishing and I'm not going to be able to make it to Vela Farms. Can you go pick up that gift basket for Papa? And I love you." And it just the tone of it to me was scripted. phrased in a way to show that he was devoted to this girl, and I don't want to have the suspicion on me, so I'm leaving this recording to get you guys on a different track. So we're suspicious of a lot of things because people that to talk to detectives oftentimes have a reason to lie, and so you have to verify these through a variety of different ways. When Al Brocchini called me in on Christmas Day and he told me what had happened to Laci and that she was missing, and then he did the bio on her and told me about her, my belief was this was a murder case, and at the time it was a no-body case. There is a protocol to follow when you're investigating a case where you don't yet have a body, and I had just had one of those the August prior. And I had that protocol, and so we started working this as a no-body homicide. We didn't tell the media that. We certainly didn't tell the family that. But you can only gather evidence in chronological order if you know what you're doing. And if you don't work it as a homicide from the beginning, you're going to overlook and you're going to lose evidence that you're going to need later on. So those things are kept confidential in the investigation. You don't release that. And when it came to this, we got to the point where there were little avalanches of information that would come in. So like when Amber came up on the radar, there was like an avalanche of things that we had to do within a short period of time. And just about the time we were finishing getting that all investigated, then another avalanche of information would come in. And the case kind of had that for the whole 4 months or so that we worked on it. When we were getting towards the tail end, before the bodies showed up, there really wasn't much left to do on this except convince the DA to file charges against Scott, get an arrest warrant, and bring him in and start the process. Jim Brazelton was the district attorney in Stanislaus County at the time. Gifted prosecutor. If you'd ever seen Brazelton in court prosecuting a case, he's straight out of central casting. He was tall, he distinguished, he had the voice, he commanded the courtroom. The judge might have been on the bench, but Jim Brazelton owned that courtroom when he was in there. But we didn't plead with him, but we told him, hey, this is what we've got. We think we got a good case here. And he pretty much said, I need a body before you get a filing. And we just thought, well, okay, that's the way it goes. So we were clearing up and tidying up loose ends so we weren't going to be in a rush. And then just like on clockwork, we get a big storm that comes through San Francisco Bay. And when it does that, the tidal surge apparently was violent enough to separate Connor from Laci, and he drifted ashore. And then it was enough to separate her from her limbs, and then her remains were brought ashore over a period of a couple of days. I remember when the first body was found, I was not optimistic at all. When Connor was discovered, I thought, yeah, there's a lot of people in the Bay Area. Somebody else could have dumped a child in here. And it's not the first time that happened. And then the next day when Laci's remains were found, in the condition they were found, that kind of pretty much cinched it. So we probably were on the right track then at that time, but we still had to wait for DNA. So we devised a game plan to do an intercept on Scott down by San Diego. He'd been under surveillance for weeks by that time. California Department of Justice was just a great agency to work with. One of their lead agents, Ernie Lamone, fantastic. His whole crew, great guys. Skilled agents, and they had Scott under surveillance. So we were able to get an arrest warrant for Scott, pre-complaint arrest warrant, and Al Carter, Al Brocchini, Craig Grogan, and I, the three of us, or the four of us, jumped in two separate cars, and we drove down to San Diego. And then the next day, we started following Scott with great assistance from DOJ. And Scott knew he was being tailed. Claims were he thought it was the media. Maybe he did. Maybe he thought it was us. Who knows? Only he knows. Only he would tell. Probably won't, but he could. And we started following him. But his driving was becoming dangerous. He was a pretty good driver. He'd be in the left lane, and he'd cross over 3 lanes of traffic, take an off-ramp. We couldn't do that. We'd roll the car. And so he was able to avoid and evade our tail on him. Even the air unit lost him at one time. The air unit missed out on him. But one of the agents saw him cross an intersection right in front of him. And so the chase was back on. It was no lights and siren, but finally, our concern was, and Craig Grogan's call was, because he's a case agent, was we need to make the arrest on Scott even before the DNA results come back. And the arrangement was the judge gave us the arrest warrant with the request to hold the execution of the warrant until the DOJ DNA results were announced. But the concern was that erratic driving was going to injure one of us or somebody who wasn't even connected to the case. So that's when he was arrested at Torrey Pines at the entrance to the golf course. Talked to him right there at the scene of the arrest. No outrage, no protests. You got the wrong guy. You guys are rookies. This is amateur hour. You guys, you don't know what you're doing. I mean, he just was pleasant as usual. And anyway, hair was dyed, of course, trying to disguise himself. And that was pretty much his demeanor. And I know if it was me, I would have been protesting, making a lot of noise about it. But Scott, he's a pretty cool cucumber for the most part when it comes to these things. After the arrest was made, they took him over to the DOJ office. And while he was there, we towed his car over there. I did the inventory on the car. He had nearly $15,000 in cash, his brother's driver's license, 3 cell phones, clothing that would work for a elegant event at the yacht club to hiking boots if you're camping in the Sierras. When a guy is arrested in California, if he's arrested outside of the county where the charges are going to be filed, he has the right to say, I'm not going back with you guys. And he can request being booked into the local jail in the jurisdiction where he's arrested. And I was kind of hoping Scott would do that. I didn't want to drive back up to Modesto with him in the back seat. But Scott's pretty pleasant. I'll go back with you. I was like, oh, great. That's fantastic. So anyway, it's like a 6-hour drive from San Diego to Modesto. And you're not going to have him cuffed behind his back for a drive like that. So you put him in ankle cuffs with a chain between them so you can walk, but they don't have enough length so he can't run. And then you have a chain belt that goes around him with a padlock and handcuffs that are at the hips. So he can have his hands here. He can, scratch his face or something like that, but he's cuffed so he can't fight you and he can't, choke you when you're driving. And he's sitting behind me and we drive and Grogan's next to him. Al Carter and Al Brocchini are in their car. And we get the call from DOJ that the results confirm that the remains were Connor and Laci. Craig tells that after the call to Scott, and he makes like a little sniffle, like a half-hearted attempt to show some emotion. And I'm kind of looking in the mirror at him, and it just wasn't anything. And I thought, well, that pretty much cinches it for me, because a guy who kills his wife 4 months earlier, that's about the reaction he's going to have. We drive a few more miles. We're getting into Bakersfield and getting gas, and cops like to eat. I mean, you can tell by some of them because they're kind of large, and some of them maybe not so. But we still got another 3.5 hours from Bakersfield back to Modesto, 3 hours. And so I open up the back door of the car. I'm putting gas in it, and I asked Scott, I said, hey, we're going to get a bite to eat. We'll feed you if you want to eat with us. And he was pleasant the whole time. He wasn't kicking the seat or going wacky or anything like that. And just told him, well, we're probably going to get fast food. We're not going to do a sit down at Outback. And he said, well, what are you getting? And I said, well, I know there's an In-N-Out burger. People that don't live in California, In-N-Out burger is pretty popular in California. Pretty good burgers. And so I said, we'll stop there and grab you something if you want something. And he just kind of gave a thoughtful look. And he said, I'll have a double with cheese, a fry, and a small vanilla shake. And I'm thinking, well, that's a pretty good order other than the cheese. I don't know why you'd put cheese on a burger, but people do. And I said, yeah, you got it. And closed the door. And that pretty much cinched it for me. One last piece of circumstantial evidence that told me that he did it. If you've ever experienced a death in a family, trauma like that, food is pretty low on your priority list. Being able to eat after receiving news like that, especially when you contrast it, and this is a thing that I think some people miss out on. When you look at the interviews, whether it was Diane Sawyer, Ted Rowlands, or Gloria Gomez, and they're talking to Scott, and he's faking this emotion about missing out on his son. And then when he's finally given this information that his son is dead, his wife is dead, and he still wants a burger, I guess you can still think that he didn't do it, but I'm not part of that camp. Over the years, one of the things I noticed in jury trials is the faces are different from the jurors, but the expressions seem to be the same with every juror on every trial. And it's really hard to get a good read on what their reactions are to different things. I know with this trial, Amber was pretty much the star of it. People, if they've never sat through a jury trial before, they've never seen what it's like other than on television, they don't really know how boring it can really be. And the thing is it's laying out evidence over a period of time, especially when you have a lot of circumstantial evidence and then it's being attacked, can seem like one of the most boring things you could be involved in. And as a juror, you're probably sitting there going, when are you going to get to the point? But the thing is there's procedures that have to be done. And so jurors are kind of subjected to, things. And the other thing that is present with jury trials a lot of the time is there's evidence that is not allowed to be heard by the jurors. I don't like that. I think everything should be presented to the jurors because the truth is the truth, whether it cuts for or against. And this is one of the reasons that I've maintained, and I was trained by one of the best detectives ever, Dick Ridenour. He always told me, he said, you put everything in your report that is good for the defendant and everything in your report that is bad for the defendant. Because if you leave things out of your report that are favorable for the guy that's going to be on trial and they're found out about, you'll be ripped apart to shreds on the witness stand. And it's much easier if you just walk down the middle and you don't really take a side. Now, like with Scott, like I said, he's kind of hard not to like, other than the murder part of him. So I could walk through this case with him, and I didn't really have any desire that, well, we have to get him. We're just searching for the truth and presenting it to a jury, and they're the ones who are going to decide it. But the trial was just kind of a normal trial, went a little bit longer because of the media coverage and all the things that went along with the case. But I thought we had a good judge there in DeLucchi. He'd since passed away. And we had really good jurors, I thought. Of course, obviously I'm going to think that way because of the verdict. But they seem to analyze things. There's a couple of them in particular that speak frequently. Maybe not frequently, but when you have shows like this, they're on it, and they have a very good demeanor about how they looked at the case.
1 second.
That was not a beer. That was not a beer.
That's beer sounds good. Your quick thoughts on the LA Innocence Project and his attempt now.
California state prisons are probably, I mean, I'm just saying this from my aspect. I believe they're probably the most professional custodial organization in the world. I dealt with a lot of the parole agents over the years and went to many of the state prisons on different murder cases. These guys play Major League Baseball. They do it right. And for the inmates, it's not a pleasant place to be. It's dangerous. It is violent. It is noisy. It doesn't smell good. And it's just, I don't even like being there for a day. But I can't imagine being there for 20, 30 years because it's just hideous. It has a very interesting culture to it, the state prisons, because of the gang influence. It's not a pleasant place to be, which is the reason that Scott is always going to maintain his innocence. Because if he ever admitted that he did this, then his chances of ever getting out are gone. So, of course, when you've got a good story, you stay with it, and that's his only hope of getting out. The LA Innocence Project, loosely connected with the Innocence Project, has taken on this fight, and their desire is to have more evidence tested. I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with any evidence being tested, retested, triple tested. Makes no difference to me. I believe the right guy is locked up for this crime, and any evidence testing is not going to bring forth any other conclusion. If there's objections to testing evidence, and there may be legal ones that the attorneys have, but from my seat right here, I have no objection to testing evidence because I don't believe we have anything to hide whatsoever. And so when I've said this before, when they make noise that we've got evidence that we want to test and the judge grants only some of it, I'm not privy to all the information on what's been tested and what hasn't been. And if there's stuff that needs to be retested, my feeling is test it. Take away the mystery, take away the skepticism, show it for what it is, and put this thing to rest so that Scott can serve out his term. But anyway, of all of this, if you watch this and you're not in a coma from listening to me, think of Sharon and think of Laci, because that's really what this cold case was all about.
What are you up to now these days?
Well, I get to hang out with guys with Star Wars shirts, which is a great thing.
Yeah.
I'm extremely lucky that my life at the moment is very, very pleasant. I have so much to be thankful for, and I don't deserve it, but I'm very thankful for it. My children are healthy. They provide me with a lot of joy. I have great friends. The water's warm down here, so that's always nice. But in spite of all of that, I miss working the murders. I know it sounds probably macabre, but I worked with some of the greatest people on the planet, great detectives. I'll probably end up leaving some out, but Ray Coyle, Kevin Bertolato, Dodge Hendy, Dennis Holmes, Al Brocchini, Tom Blake, Craig Grogan, Dick Ridenauer, Jim Waterman, Roger Lee, Bill Grogan, just a whole bunch of them. Great supervisors, Al Carter, Roger Higbee, guys like that, Dave Scott, Tom Donaldson. I mean, I could go on with names, but that job to me, was so much fun. The tragedy aside, I didn't like dealing with the bodies. I didn't like the autopsies. I felt bad for families. But if you want to do something that's interesting, more interesting than just about anything that I could think of, working the murders was it. They didn't put restrictions on us. They let us go where the leads took us. We worked with other agencies, whether it was state parole, with all the parole agents over there, the DOJ guys, both in the lab and the agents themselves, other agencies, police agencies, sheriff's offices. I just enjoyed working around cops and those associated with them. The prosecutors, the DAs, and even, it's probably kind of wild, there were a lot of great defense attorneys that I liked a lot. Doing their job, quality control for law enforcement. Didn't have any heartburn with any of them. Biggest frustration in law enforcement for working cops is administration. Probably the biggest frustration is some of the things that they come up with, not rooted in any common sense whatsoever on occasion. But other than that, life's good. No complaints at the moment. That, it's fleeting. It only lasts so long, so you enjoy it while you can. I'm skeptical of people until I get to know them. I'd like to be trusting, but it's kind of hard because you see, after doing that job, you see what people are capable of. I'm glad I'm down here in Florida because I don't have constant reminders of it. If I stayed in California, I would have constant reminders of all those things. But I moved to Florida to get away from that. I still miss the job, but I don't miss the intrusive thoughts from the things that happened. So I try to go out of my way for the people that I care about, and try not to create too many ripples behind me.